Sometimes we study the Torah with a kind of tunnel vision. We become satisfied with the stories and interpretations we were taught as children. But once in a while we pause to think twice, and then suddenly it seems to make no sense at all. There's a classic example of this in this week's Torah portion. The Jews have left Egypt. They're petrified of the Egyptians. They run away. After a few days, Pharaoh realizes the Jews are not returning, so he gathers his army to pursue after the Jews. The Jews arrive at the Red Sea, and now they're trapped. In front of them, the sea. Behind them, the Egyptians. How do they react? The Torah tells us they react with panic and fear. Some of them say, let's just jump into the sea. Perhaps we'll live, perhaps we'll die. Others say, let's wave our white flag and retreat back to Egypt. But why were the Jews so afraid? 600,000 Jewish males between the age of 20 and 60 left Egypt out of a nation of about 2 million. That's a huge, powerful army. Of course, not an organized army, but they just spent their whole lives in slave labor. They were strong, they were mighty. Whereas the Egyptians, who were a superpower, just went through a whole year of 10 plagues, which crushed their economy, shattered their infrastructure. The death of the firstborns completely demoralized and weakened them. They were in no position to fight a war. So why were the Jews so afraid? Many years ago, scientists performed an experiment with a barracuda fish, that quick, predatory fish that can easily devour the smaller fish. And they placed the barracuda in a tank together with other weak fish. But they placed a glass wall between the barracuda and the other fish. The barracuda saw the other fish, ran after them, and bang, banged his head against the wall. A few minutes later, he tried the same thing and banged his head against the wall. This went on for many days. Eventually, the barracuda realized he can't catch those fish, and so he stops even trying. At that point, the scientists removed the glass wall from the tank to see how the barracuda would react. Well, the barracuda simply gave up. Even though he could catch those fish now, he didn't even bother trying. And this is what psychologists refer to as learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is when, through past failures of life, we tell ourselves we're always going to fail. It's called the 3 Ps: permanence, pervasiveness, and personal. Because we've failed in the past, we're going to fail in the future. And the reason we've failed is because something is wrong with us. What are those things in your life that you've been told or life has told you that you just cannot do? You're not smart enough, strong enough, talented enough. And because of that, you don't even bother trying anymore. That's called learned helplessness. Perhaps that explains the Jews at the Red Sea. Since they were born, they were told, we're the slave, they're the master. We're weak, they're strong. And so even now, after leaving Egypt and becoming a free people, facing seemingly a weaker nation, the Egyptians, they told themselves the same thing. We're weak, they're strong, and we cannot defeat them. Now, fortunately, the same psychologists who taught us about learned helplessness also taught us about learned optimism, where we are able to undo those 3 Ps, the feeling of permanence, pervasiveness, and personal, and tell ourselves, just because we've failed in the past does not mean we're going to fail in the future. And the reason we failed is not because it's something wrong with us. It just wasn't the right opportunity. And through a lot of learning and cognitive effort, we're able to rewire our thinking to think optimistically with faith, hope, and courage. Maybe that explains the Jewish journey in the desert for 40 years. First, they received the Torah from God. The Torah tells them, God tells them, you are a free nation. You're able to determine the course and the outcome of your life. And so after 40 years of learning this optimism, they arrive into Israel, capable now to build a free, sovereign nation. In the early 20th century, there was a great Jewish German physician and scientist, Paul Ehrlich. He and his team were searching for the cure to syphilis. Finally, they found the cure, and they called it Compound 606. He won a Nobel Prize for this cure. It was called the magic bullet that could cure syphilis. But why did they call it Compound 606? Because for 4 years and 605 attempts before then, Ehrlich and his team failed at discovering the cure. And only on the 606th time did they find it, did they succeed. Imagine if Dr. Ehrlich would have told his team after the 605th time, my friends, we've tried, we've failed, we're never going to find this cure. They would never have discovered compound 606. This week's Torah portion teaches us about learned helplessness, but also learned optimism. When the Jews left Egypt, they told themselves they're weak and helpless. But after receiving the Torah and their journey in the desert, they learned that they can be a free people, a proud people, build a beautiful Jewish nation, and go on to change the world. As Nelson Mandela once said, it always seems impossible until it is done. The Jews taught us that even though it seemed impossible, still it was done. Shabbat Shalom.